Welcome to or welcome back to How to Change the World. I am Catherine Alonzo, and today I have with me David Waid, my co-founding partner of Javelina and our resident expert on all things political campaigns and political industry. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. This is fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, and back in the day, you and I have recorded many a podcast interview together, but this is your first time as a guest on our reimagined, relaunched podcast, and I am so excited to have you with me today. And today what we're doing is a Changemaker chat. So these are our short form episodes where we have a resident expert to join us to talk about something relevant for the day. And today what we're going to be talking about is this incredible 2024 election season. And more specifically, what I'm really excited to talk to you about is everything that you have learned and observed from the primary season, which for the most part is coming to a close. And really at the state level, the local level, and the federal level, we're really now turning into the general election season. And so what I want to ask you about today is some of the things you saw in the primaries and those lessons that you're carrying forward and that we can all carry forward, not only as candidates, but also as voters and people who are actively engaged in politics and elections at the local level. To start us off, why don't you tell me a little bit about your journey to this point and some of the contours of your political career?
All right. Well, I've been in Arizona now for just a little over 20 years, but sort of cut my political eye teeth, as it were, in New York. I was the deputy chief of staff to the Speaker of the State Assembly. I came out from there to be the finance director of the Arizona Democratic Party, and then in pretty short order became the executive director and then the chairman of the state party, and then formed sort of the precursor to this firm. And now within Javelina, in this sort of latest incarnation, I am vice president of political work and do really kind of all the work on the campaign side. So campaigns can really be a lot of things, right? Obviously, there's candidate campaigns, but there's also, we do ballot measures, we do school bonds and overrides. There's campaigns that we have run that have been very specifically around influencing the state legislature on legislation that was particularly important. And, so it can take a lot of different sort of permutations.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, I'm very excited to be able to tap into and pick your incredible political brain and the decades of experience that you have and how we can apply that to this very specific moment that it feels like we're in right now. So David, before we started recording, you and I were chatting about what we are going to talk about. And one of the things that you shared with me was something that you noticed in the primary elections with certain candidates who were not successful, who lost their seats. So can you tell me a bit about what you were mentioning there and what you took away from it?
Sure. I mean, I think, one of the things that we saw that was kind of a standout for me anyway, was that there were some people, progressive Democrats who lost their primaries. Particularly, there were two members of what is known as the Squad, right, that's very closely aligned with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, members of the Squad. Those two members were Jamal Bowman, who is he lost his primary in Westchester County in New York, and Cori Bush, who lost in Missouri. There was a lot of factors, lots of factors went into those losses. It wasn't just they happened to be progressives, right? There was, $25, $35 million spent against them in these two races. So it is a huge expenditure against them, ginormous. And I think that that clearly had an impact. You can't deny that. But I do think that in each case, they sort of were, outflanked in the primary, and partially because they had, I think, gotten themselves away from where the voters were in their districts, right? And I think that's a really easy thing to do. I mean, I think, number one, if you are in Congress and mostly in your DC and you're surrounded by people that you know and who know you and they tell you a lot of stuff or maybe tell you all things you want to hear, well, that also you find that, and I find this is really true on sort of both sides of the political spectrum, but you find that in social media. So within the progressive community, there's just a lot of stuff on Twitter, and like that's where I sort of see it most, X. But you see a lot of chatter that just, I think that the people who are in those echo chambers, which is functionally what they are, begin to feel like, okay, everyone thinks as I think. We're all talking here and we're sort of saying the same things, but it doesn't actually reflect the people of a district, right? Because most of them are not on X or any of the other sort of social media things, right? So, and it's easy to sort of, so easy. I mean, literally, I've seen it a million times, but where you sort of lose track of the fact that what the folks that are out in the community are concerned about is just making their next paycheck, the next mortgage payment, next car payment, right? And they're worried about it because they may not. They're one illness in the family away from financial disaster. So, these are not the things that they necessarily are always on. And the takeaway from me isn't don't talk about progressive things, right? Like you absolutely should be talking about, authentically where you are, where your heart is from, but you got to talk about the stuff that the people who are voters are most tuned into, right? So that can be, and also you just lean into different things. And there's no question that if you are a Democrat running, you're going to be good. Well, you should be good anyway on, pocketbook issues for working families, middle-class families, and the poor. And if you can sort of lean into the things that are part of your, authentic resume and your record, and talk about those things, then you are going to be connecting with people in a way that you won't if you talk about just the sort of niche things that, only your ideological community is really talking about. I don't know. Do you see that in much yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I think you make such an important point about, as a candidate, be yourself, be authentic. And at the same time, you do have to make sure that you're talking about issues that people really care about and are really important in people's everyday lives. And I think that can sound like a really hard thing to do. And the candidates I see who do it the most effectively are those that are out in their districts talking to people, because then they are listening and they're really hearing what that everyday experience is, rather than the sort of national political headlines, which are two things that can be really divorced from each other.
That's a really good point. I actually thank you for saying that, because I have seen that recently in some races where we've been working and some races where we haven't been working, but where, it might be a municipal race or it might be a state legislative race. And, one of the candidates, part of at least what they're talking about, but significantly, is Israel. And, for most of the folks, they're not thinking about Israel. I mean, God, it's huge and it should be thought about. But most voters who are like living their daily lives and trying to make it week to week and month to month, that's not their first concern, certainly, right? And when they go to vote for somebody who's running for the city council or running for the state legislature, they want to know that they're focused on things like schools or trash pickup or job creation, right? Like things, minimum wage, right? There's so many things that are kind of more priority for those folks. And again, this doesn't mean you can't talk about the things that you want to talk about. By all means, talk about those. You got to just touch on the things that the people, it's really going to motivate them to vote and vote for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you more about that. Before we do, I'm going to go to a quick ad break. And then when we come back, I'm going to ask you more about this idea of getting outside of your own echo chamber.
Sounds good. Thanks.
At Javelina, developing and telling stories that create change is our bread and butter. It's why we get up in the morning, and if you are a nonprofit seeking to create change, we would love to help you do just that. We provide purpose-driven branding and marketing services to help changemakers like you tell your story, maximize your impact, and build strong connections with your communities. We know that you have an incredible story to tell, and we want to help you tell it. Head to javelina.co to check out our services and schedule a free consultation today to find out how together we can change the world.
Welcome back, and welcome back, David. So before our ad break, you were telling me about your takeaways from the primary. And one of the things you talked about that really struck me was how it's very easy to get stuck in kind of an echo chamber where we're listening to the same ideas over and over and over. And it leads me so nicely into one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which is this palpable negativity that we are all living in at the moment. Everywhere you go, every headline you read, and conversations that we are all having in our communities, there is this really solid, consistent idea that things are headed in the wrong direction, that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and that our communities are a dumpster fire, if you will. And it is something that I hear and see all the time. And so my question for you is, how should candidates this year navigate this negativity, this lack of hope that people have in the future? And not only how should candidates navigate that, but how should voters navigate that?
I think the way candidates should approach it, and by the way, I think that would extrapolate out to people who are working on ballot measures. There's all those kinds of things where you're going to the voters. You see that negativity frequently, regardless of what it is. You do especially see it with candidates. But anyway, I would say the people who are really sort of cynical in politics, they just kind of go willy-nilly, not in a really smart way, honestly, into the negatives because they kind of see that negatives work. And they do, right? But what they miss is that getting people to nod along with what you're saying and to sort of really feel that you're offering hope and inspiration gets so undercounted, the importance of that. And I can think of a couple places. First of all, I will say that the person who really put the phrase in my head anyway, originally was Bill Clinton. And I think it was might have been for Obama's first race for president. Anyway, what he said was, I think it was during the primary when it was Hillary against Obama. And Bill Clinton had a quote somewhere that said, the most positive campaign wins. And I really think there's a lot of truth to that. And you honestly saw that with Barack Obama's campaign. It was the one that literally lit hope and inspiration in people. You saw it in the primary, you saw it in the general election. And I think it's worth noting that this moment at which Kamala Harris's numbers really just surged after she jumped in, there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the things was this sort of just hope and positive thing. And by the way, it's funny. I was just reading an article, I think it was Jeff Greenfield had written this thing about how Kamala Harris, even though she's the vice president, is coming across as the change candidate. And it's really true. Again, another link back to Obama, right? So it was like sort of positive, hopeful change. And I think that those are really powerful. They can actually literally overcome a lot of negative campaigning. Now I say that, but then there's the caveat, which is sort of twofold, right? One is if you are a candidate running for office and the other side is unleashing torrents of negative against you, if you don't respond, and I don't mean respond saying, no, that's not true, but respond in kind, odds are you're going to lose that election, right? That's not 100%, but it's up there. So I think that you can't just close yourself off to negative campaign. And negative, I think a lot of people are turned off by the word. If it makes you feel better, call it contrast. Because I think there's people who are comfortable with saying contrast, and contrast could mean, I'm just doing like one of those charts where you say, here's me, here's my opponent, here's all these issues, and here's how we voted or think about these issues. That's a contrast. It's also kind of negative because you're saying I'm good, this person's bad on the following issues, right? So I think that, in terms of that negative stuff, I think you have to be aware of it. And the other thing is, if you are running against somebody who is actually really bad, you're not doing a moral thing by not going negative. Honestly, the reality is voters need to know that. You can't expect them to just know that, for instance, the woman who's running for county attorney here in Maricopa County wants the 1864 abortion law to be the law of Arizona. Right? People don't know that. You've got to tell them that. And it's important that you tell them that and for them to be able to consider that when making their decision. So that's like my thinking about sort of how it works in sort of campaigns. And then as far as like how do you sort of respond as a voter, that's trickier. I mean, obviously, as a voter, I respond all the time to that kind of stuff, right? And I'm in the congressional district where Amish Shah just won the Democratic primary, and there was a lot of negative that was flying around all over the place, back and forth, all the different candidates, et cetera. By the way, I think that Amish didn't do any negative campaigning and really just focused on the positive. So that is a sort of unique case where he didn't engage. But it is also worth noting that there were, I think, 5 or 6 candidates in that race. And when he won by like a percentage point. It was like 23 point something versus 24 point something, right? So a very, very narrow election. But anyway, so I think that in terms of how I look at it, honestly, kind of just look at what the attacks are. Some of them, if you just think about it, you can see how they're either trying to be really tricky with their language. They're trying to imply something that's not true without actually saying a lie. And you can hear it if they're using kind of vague or, again, sort of like just a little bit off language. And sometimes you just have to kind of a little bit go by your gut with, what you know about these people. You might have met them at the door. Or, you may have met them at a meeting or something like that. And, some of the stuff that, people say may not jibe with what your experience of this person is. That's pretty imprecise, but, what are you going to do? You ultimately have to make your decision with the information that's available to you. So I end up facing that same choice as everybody else, but that's, I guess, how I handle it. I'm kind of curious, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that what I try to do as a voter and also as somebody who speaks to other voters, speaks to people who are in social change, is to offer this alternative view that is more positive, is to acknowledge, yes, there is a lot of negativity and a lot to feel negative about, and there is incredible work happening at the local level. And really on a one-on-one level, but also through our podcast and through our channels at Javelina, is to shine a spotlight on those that are doing incredible work. And I think that just in my individual tiny way contributes to the idea of not necessarily counterbalancing the negativity, but offering another option. Offering another way of seeing the world. And I find that helpful on an individual level. For me, I find the everything sucks narrative very toxic on an individual level for me. And so I really need this alternative option, which is there's good work happening and there's a lot of progress being made. And so I try and feed that for myself and for others.
Well, I got to say, sometimes I find it funny. And I'll explain why the negative stuff, right? This is probably 4 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. There was this period where the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC, was doing email solicitations, and their email solicitations, I'm serious, totally 100%, this is true, no joke. They used the end is near as one of their things, right? The world is ending was one of their things. They literally use this crazy, like laughably over the top language. The wacky thing is it actually worked for them. Like the reason they did it was because they did what's called A/B testing. They tested a version that was like that against a version that wasn't like that. This version got us more money. Boom, decision made, right? Like they would just go with whatever was going to generate them the most money. Now, what ended up ultimately getting them off that was because while on the short term, it did get them more money, in the long term, they lost more people off their list. So it ended up not being a net positive for them. But I think it's worth noting that the reason why people do this is because it's driving up the stakes, right? It means, if the world's ending, that's way more high stakes than if it's like, the cost of a quart of milk is going to go up, right? And so it's just people default to that because it's easier. It's an easier way to get people mobilized. You particularly see that kind of language when you're trying to turn out your voter base, right? So when they talk to the MAGA base, they're not saying those Democrats, we disagree, we politely disagree with them on a number of issues. Respectfully, I think you guys are wrong. No, they're like,
Right.
Democrats are socialists who are going to destroy our country. They've already destroyed it, blah, 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 blah. Again, they're trying to gin up this intensity on their side. And you see that in all types of elections. Again, it could be on a ballot measure where you
Right.
do that kind of language to gin up intensity.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. At the top of the ticket this year, we are deciding, the main narrative from each side is you are deciding between the continuation of democracy, that Democrats running for president are saying that if Republicans win, democracy will end. And then on the other side, individual freedom. Republicans are saying if Democrats win, your individual freedom will go away. And so when you as a voter are being told you are choosing between democracy and individual freedom, that's high stakes. That is high stakes, really scary, extreme language. And so how do you think that people running on the local level should navigate these themes of democracy and individual freedom? And then how do they relate them to local issues that local people care about?
Well, I mean, I think actually, first of all, a thing that I think a few people may realize, but when you look, especially the more local you get, municipal elections in particular, and that doesn't mean they're small elections, they can be very big, but the kind of voters who turn out for municipal elections are a little bit different than most, right? If the election takes place away from when state ledge or presidential kind of elections are taking place, then the people who turn out, it's a much smaller turnout audience, right? Fewer people are turning out for that election. And it tends to be the ones who are much more educated about the community and much more plugged into the community and sort of consequently much older, right? So it's that is the sort of spectrum of voters you see in a municipal election. And what we have found just time and time again on municipal elections is that what they want is services. It's funny because it doesn't really apply in a congressional race. You would think it would, like the same logic should be there, or a state ledge race. But in municipal elections, they really are looking for they want to know that the candidate who's running is going to make sure that the garbage gets picked up on time, that, their streets are safe, just very clockwork kind of stuff. If you can pass that smell test, you're in pretty good shape there. Mm-hmm. But I think also I will say, and here's where I let my Democratic flag fly a little bit. I mean, because there have been many Democrats elected over the course of the history of the United States, and the country's still standing. So I think we can say that it's not true that the world's going to end if a Democrat gets elected president or something like that. And I would also say that it's not true that the country is going to end if a Republican gets elected. So I think, if they're saying that Democrats will end democracy, the U.S. will become a third world nation, blah, 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 blah. That's clearly, we've got enough history to know that Democrats in power doesn't do that, right? I think it's more with on the Republican side, if I wouldn't actually believe that if a Republican got elected president or got elected governor or to the state legislature, the world is going to end, right? It's not going to end. However, and this is where I sort of, again, let my Democratic flag fly. If Donald Trump wins, certain things will happen, right? And some of that does involve literally democracy, right? Because he has made it clear that he wants to undermine elections in this country. He is pursuing an agenda that includes replacing tens of thousands of federal government employees who are bureaucrats and just protected by civil service rules. He wants to replace them with political appointees, right? He's literally said that if he gets elected, he's going to be an autocrat. He's literally said that if he gets elected, he's going to exact vengeance on all the people who, made his life miserable by holding him accountable. And I think, as many people have said, after Roe v. Wade, you pretty much better take him at his word. If he says he's going to do it, he's likely going to do it. He wants to do it. It's not hyperbole. He's really coming for those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and which is why I wanted to ask you about how do people on the local level navigate those things? Not to say that they're not a real threat, but also based on what you said when we at the beginning of the conversation about why some progressives lost seats and the importance of meeting voters where they are. And I think some voters, many voters, aren't necessarily on a day-to-day basis thinking about the continuation of democracy. They're thinking about, like you said, getting their kids in a good school, being able to work, make bills. And so making that connection for voters when you're working on the local level. And I think it's not necessarily an easy needle to thread because a lot of voters are really thinking about those high level issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's 100% true.
Yeah.
I think that right now, as we look at polling all over the place, in Arizona, nationally, whatever, you'll see that there are people who it may not be that abortion specifically is the thing that's energizing them, or it may not be, whatever sort of issues that we've got with the MAGA crowd in specific. But extremism is actually polling as a very, very high concern for a lot of voters. Now, predictably, a lot of those voters are our base, but it is actually, I just was seeing a poll that 51% of Americans, right now, understand that when they do these polls and it's like 51% this and 38% that, there's a huge chunk of people who either refuse to say or are undecided, right? Yeah. So 51% is a really big number. 51% of Americans think that Republicans are too extreme, and they would describe them as extreme candidates. So there are things that can penetrate, maybe not as specific things, but people are getting impressions. And, you find that like on the Democratic side, we get that too, right? 100%. You can say that these are right or wrong impressions, but people have impressions that Democrats are soft on crime, right? And by extension, sort of soft on immigration and border security. There's certain things that, you could be the toughest hawk on earth, but people are going to believe what they believe, not necessarily what is true.
Right. Well, David, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I've loved this conversation, and maybe we'll do another one after the general and do some look back and see.
That'd be fun.
See how some of our conversation, how our predictions kind of turned out.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you.